The sky was still as stone. The clouds never lingered long over the orphanage, nor did the sun ever seem to truly touch the land. It was as if the mountains themselves stood as sentinels, keeping watch over the valley, casting their shadows in silent judgment. The orphanage, a fortress of crumbling stone, sat at the edge of the dying town, a place abandoned by time, forgotten by history. Its bell tower, though, was never forgotten. Elias Becker sat alone in his office, the walls a maze of dust and memories. The dark wood of his desk was worn smooth, the ink in his quill dry. He did not move, his eyes unfocused on the paper before him. His thoughts were adrift, caught in a place between the present and something darker, something that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. It was not the bell that troubled him now, not the tolling of the ancient bell that had become a part of him, that had echoed through his free bones for so many years. It was the silence that followed, that terrible silence. He had heard it, that last toll. The bell had rung, as it had done for every child that had ever entered the orphanage, but this time it was different. The sound had lingered, stretched out like a breath that refused to end, as though the very air itself had become emessificated by its weight. That was the last time he had heard it. The children had left, as they always did, one by one. Some had found families, those others had found only cold graves beneath the overgrown cemetery that lay beyond the orphanage. Elias had never been able to reconcile that fact. Not with the children, not with the ones who had died here, forgotten, lost to time and neglect. And yet, the bell had always tolled, once, for each of them, a reminder of what had been, a marker of their passing. He could still hear it now. The tolling, only this time, it was for him. The bell tower stood tall against the overcast sky, its shape twisted and gnarled, as though it had been scarred by the very storms it had weathered. Elias had never dared to go near it, never stepped inside its rusted doors, even when the children had begged him to. There was something about it, something ancient, something that felt as though it had always been there, waiting, watching. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but there was no warmth in it. The air smelled of rot and decay, of the earth itself turning beneath the weight of years. Elias pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled into his bones. He had never been one for warmth, he had never been one for comfort. In the distance, the bell tolled again. He rose from his desk, his legs stiff with age, and walked slowly to the window. The glass was cracked, spiderwebbed, but the view was the same as it had always been. The crumbling stone walls, the decaying trees that had once been full of life, and in the distance, the bell tower, still standing tall and silent, like a monument to something that could never be forgotten. Elias knew what he had to do. He had always known. He crossed the room with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had, long ago, given up on the notion of escape. There was no running from the past. Not here, not in this place, not with the bell tolling for him. Even now, as he descended the creaking stairs of the orphanage, his mind wandered back to the first child he had ever taken in, a boy with dark eyes and a solemn face, who had come to him when the orphanage was still new, when the bell had still rung for hope, not death. That boy had been the first to hear the bell toll, to feel its weight in his chest, to know that the orphanage was not just a home but a tomb. Elias had tried to protect him, to shield him from the inevitable, but there had been nothing he could do. The boy had died in the winter, the year after he had arrived. His body had been found in the woods, cold and lifeless, like so many others before him, and yet the bell had tolled for him, for them all. Elias had never understood it. He had never understood why they came to him, why they stayed, why the bell tolled for them. He had never understood why it rang now for him, when he had not been a child, when he had not been innocent. The path to the bell tower was long and winding, the earth beneath his feet soft and uneven, as though it was in mourning. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. It was a familiar smell, one that Elias had long since come to associate the place that had become his prison. He reached the base of the bell tower and stopped. The door was shut tight, as it had always been, but the handle felt cold beneath his hand. He had never opened it. He had never dared, but now it was time. The door creaked as it opened, the sound harsh and grinding, like a scream held too long. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the stone walls covered in a layer of soot and grime. The bell hung above him, dark and heavy, its surface pitted with age and neglect. It had not rung in years, but Elias could still feel its presence, still hear its toll in the silence of the room. He stepped forward, his footsteps hoeing in the emptiness. He could feel the weight of the bell bearing down on him, could feel the pull of its call, the pull of something deeper, darker. The silence was deafening now, oppressive. It filled the room like a living thing, pressing in on him, choking the air from his lungs. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, could feel the breath in his chest growing shallow and quick. The bell, once so familiar, now seemed to loom over him like a great and terrible shadow. Elias reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the rusted rope that would bring the bell to life. He hesitated, and then, without warning, Theobald tolled. The sound was not like any he had ever heard before. It was not a chime, but a cry, a scream, raw and agonizing, like something had been torn from the earth itself. The sound reverberated through the stone walls, filling every corner of the room, shaking the very foundation of the tower. It was a sound that reached deep into Elias's soul, a sound that tore at the fabric of his being. And then, in the aftermath, there was silence. The last toll. And Elias, standing alone in the heart of the bell tower, felt something give way inside him. Something had broken, something that could never be fixed. The bell had tolled for him, and had answered. The shadows of the past seemed tossed around him now, darker and deeper than they had ever been before. There was no escape, no release. The bell had tolled for him, and now there was nothing left but the silence, and the weight of the years that had come before. In the distance, the wind howled through the trees, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, the unyielding cold of the mountains that had always watched, always waited. And the bell tower stood silent, its final toll fading into the dark. The attic was a world of dust and cobwebs, a forgotten space that the town's history had long since abandoned. Beneath the eaves of the town hall, the air felt thick and oppressive, as though the very rafters sighed with the weight of all that had been left unseen. The flickering light from Madeline's lantern cast long shadows across old trunks and forgotten furniture. Time had worn everything here, frayed fabric, cracked wood, and yellowed paper. The scent of mildew clung to her skin like a memory that wouldn't let go. She had not intended to be up here, not today. The town's archives had always been a place for the careful, methodical unearthing of history, a place where the past could be preserved, not disturbed. Yet, as soon as the attic door had creaked open under her hesitant hand, a strange, almost insistent pull had seized her. She couldn't explain it, this compulsion to search, to find what had been left behind. Perhaps it was the flickering image of the orphanage's ruins in her mind. The way it haunted the town, like a stain no one spoke of. Her gloved fingers brushed against a stack of brittle papers in an old wooden crate, their edges curling like the wings of moths. She hesitated, then pulled the top sheet free. The ink was faded but legible. The names, they leaped from the page in a way that made her blood freeze. Clara, Samuel, Thomas. She knew those names, of course. She did. These were children from the orphanage, children long forgotten in the town's history. The same orphanage where she had spent her childhood, its stirring presence always looming just beyond the edge of the square. A place that the town had long since swept into silence, as though pretending theophans had never existed was enough to erase them from memory. But these names, they were the names of the lost ones, the ones who had never been the ones whispered about in dark corners. The paper trembled in her hands, as if the words themselves were trying to escape. She felt it then, the subtle pressure in the air, like something unseen, pressing against her chest. It was as though the words on the page were alive, calling to her. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, but the breath caught in her throat. The attic had grown unnaturally still. She turned the page, her hands trembling, and there they were again. More names, more children, but these had never been mentioned in any of the town's records. The orphanage's history had been scrubbed clean. Not a trace remained of those who had disappeared, or worse, the ones who had never even been placed in the records at all. There were since for dead to little more than and there, at the bottom of the page, a note scribbled in an unfamiliar hand. It was barely legible, a hasty scrawl, but the words twisted like iron in her gut. They were taken, not by Thastorm, not by the fire. They were taken. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She tried to push the words away, to deny them. She was imagining things. Theseware, nothing but old, forgotten papers, relics of a time best left buried. Butch couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring in the air around her. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to find it. The beam of her lantern quivered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. She moved deeper into the attic, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust. There were more crates, more boxes, more forgotten things left to rot. Each piece of forgotten history seemed to breathe, to pulse with the weight of secrets buried long ago. She picked up another box, this only smaller, its lid nearly falling off. It was locked, but a quick tug of Theristed latch revealed more papers, each one yellowed and brittle with age. One sheet slipped from the pile as she opened the box, and it fluttered down, settling in her lap like a fragile butterfly. She picked it up and gasped. There, in the center of the paper, was a Droyan child, drawn in thick charcoal strokes, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in terror. The child was reaching out, its hands grasping for something just beyond the frame. In the corner of the paper, scrawled in the same frantic hand, was another note. They never left the bell tower. They heard it. They heard it toll for them. Madeline recoiled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The bell tower, ... that cursed place. It had been silent for years, its great iron bell long since rusted and still. No one in the town spoke of it anymore, but every child had heard its echo. Every adult had carried its toll within their bones. It had always been a symbol of something otherworldly, something ominous. And now, to find this drawing, these notes, it was as though the town itself had been built upon a lie. Her hands shook as she reached for the next paper. This one was a list and inventory, of sorts written in an elegant hand. But the names of the children from the orphanage were here again, mixed in with strange annotations, lines and scribbles, as if the writer had been losing their mind. A date stood out, March 18th, 1872. It was underlined twice, the ink nearly spilling from the page in its intensity. Beneath it, the final words struck like a dagger to her chest. The last toll. They left with it, all of them. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat now, her palms slick with sweat. The silence in the attic had deepened, pressing in on her like a suffocating weight. The town's history was no longer a tale of progress, of growth, of community. It was a house of lies. The children who had vanished, the ones who had been buried beneath layers of dust and silence. They had not been forgotten, they had been erased. And the bell tower, the same bell tower that still stood, dark and silent, at the edge. If the town held their souls, their echoes, Madeline had heard the rumors, the whispers that had always followed the orphanage. They were just stories, just frightened imaginings, the sort of things children told each other to pass time. But now, holding these papers in her hands, she knew the truth. Thebel had told for them, not once, but many times. Each toll had marked Occult, and each toll had bound them to the tower, to the town, to this terrible history that was hidden in the attic, in the shadows. She stood there for what felt like hours, the papers in her hands, heavy as lead. The air around her seemed to hum, as if the very walls of the attic were whispering, beckoning her to go further, to seek the truth that had been hidden away. But she couldn't not know. The weight of it was too much. She had uncovered the darkness of the town, the darkness of her own past, and now she was bound to it, just as the children had been. She left the attic slowly, her heart still racing, the papers clutched tightly in her hands. As the door closed behind her, the silence that followed felt even more suffocating than before. The town's history had been built upon the silence of lost souls. But no, those souls were not forgotten. Not by Madeline, not anymore. And the bell tower stood, waiting. Sister Agnes sat in the dim light of the small room she had inhabited for the last 2 decades, the air thick with the smell of dust and forgotten prayer. The walls were stripped bare now, save for the cracked portrait that hung opposite her. The portrait, once a grand depiction of the orphanage's founders, now seemed like a ghost still faded, its edges curling, the once vibrant faces now blotted. With time, it was the only thing she had left. Her gnarled fingers, thin as the branches of a long-dead tree, trembled as they gripped the edge of the frame. She could feel the cold wood against her palms, the roughness of it, like thievery structure, of her faith splintered, cracked, falling apart. The faces in the portrait stared back at her, their eyes impossibly vivid despite the decay. They were always watching her, always looking with such quiet, mournful eyes, like they knew the things she kept buried. The years had not been kind. Her once pristine habit now hung in tatters, the edges worn, the black cloth faded to grey. Her hair, once pulled tightly beneath the habit, was now wisps of white, some strands escaping and curling like the fingers of a restless hand. Sister Agnes had not spoken in years, not in any meaningful way. There was nothing left to say, not with the weight of her past pressing down upon her like a tombstone. She had been the last of them, the last of the nuns who had once walked these halls with the sacred duty offending to the children. But that was long ago, before the bell towers tolled Beckham accursed, before the orphanage fell into neglect, before everything slipped away into silence. Now, all that remained were the children's empty beds, the hollow echo of laughter that had long since died, and thepatratorwise the portrait. It was evening, the pale light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, stretching over the dust that clung to the floor like forgotten years. The clock on the mantelpiece set it steadily, its hands moving with relentless precision, counting themaments as though time itself were a thing to be endured. Sister Agnes's eyes moved over Thephases in the portrait again, lingering on each one in turn. There was Father Elias, his stern face frozen in an eternal frown, the wrinkles at his ice harp like cracks in glass. And there was Mother Clara, her eyes wide with some hidden sorrow, a smile frozen on her lips that never quite reached her eyes. They were figures from a past she could barely recall, their names slipping away in fragments of dreamlike memories. But there was one face that always held her gaze, one face that had once been hers. She remembered the day the portrait had been painted, the crisp white habit she had worn, the purity of it, the sanctity of her vows. The portrait had been commissioned when the orphanage was founded, a symbol of hope, of salvation for the lost children Thea had taken in. She had been so young then, so full of faith. She had believed in the purity of her work, in the righteousness of the path she had chosen. But now, the memory of it was like a scar, something that would never heal. Sister Agnes's hands shook violently as she reached up to touch the portrait, her fingers brushing the surface, tracing the outline of her own face. She had not seen herself in years, not in any mirror, not in any reflection. She had abandoned all that once defined her, her identity lost in the suffocating silence of this room, buried beneath the weight of all that had happened. The silence was broken by the creaking of the floorboards behind her. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge Thea's command. She knew what it was. She always knew. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel the weight of the past closing in on her, a pressure in her chest that made it harder to breathe. The shadows from the corner of the room stretched and flickered, seeming to twist as though something was moving in the dark. There was no sound, no footsteps, but Sister Agnes felt the presence of the ones who had never left, the ones whose names had been erased, whose faces had faded into the cracks. After time her eyes darted to the corner of the room, and for a moment she saw them, the children, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow, staring at her from the edges of the room. They were always there, waiting, watching. They had never left, not really. "Forgive me," she whispered, few words barely escaping her lips, a prayer for a redemption she no longer believed in. She turned back to the portrait, her fingers tightening. Around the frame, the crack ran through the glass like a wound, splitting the image in two. But the eyes, their eyes, still they were pleading now, pleading for her to remember, to confess, to finally speak the truth that had been buried so deep inside her for so long. Sister Agnes closed her eyes, but the face remained, their eyes burning into her mind, into her soul. She had never told Nyon what happened, what she had seen, what she had done. She had taken vows, she had sworn an oath, but the darkness had seeped in, first slowly, like a shadow, and then all at once, swallowing everything whole. She could still hear their voices, the children's voices whispering in the corners of her mind. "Sister Agnes, why did you leave us? Why did you let us go?" The memories returned in flashes, fragments of faces, of names, of the whispers in the hallways, the queries of the children who had been lost, who had never left the orphanage, whole had been buried in its walls. She had been the one who was supposed to protect them, to shelter them, to save them, but she had failed, and now she was alone. Alone with the portrait, alone with the guilt that pressed down on her chest, alone with the silence that had taken everything from her. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows creeping in until the light from the window was swallowed completely. The children were gone, their voices silenced. The air was still again, as it had been for years, thick with the weight of what could never bund on. Sister Agnes stood motionless, the cracked portrait still clutched in her trembling hands. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and for a moment, the faces of the founders seemed to shift before her. Then, with a soft, agonized whisper, she spoke again. "I'm sorry," but no one was there to hear her. Elias sat alone in the dim light of the chapel, the scent of aged wood and incense thick in the air, mingling with the faint echo of whispered prayers from the children who still remained. His hands, once steady as he guided their faith, now trembled as they rested on the worn surface of the pew. The fire-colored flicker of the candles before the altar seemed to mirror the unrest that twisted in his chest. A growing he-thought gnawed at his soul, relentless as the passage of time. She had been the first, the one whose name Elias had never dared to speak aloud, even in the quiet solace of rare Eliza, the girl with the hair like flame, like the dying embers of Ari, that had long since gone cold. Her disappearance, so sudden, so absolute, had left a crack in the very foundation of the orphanage, one that no amount of prayer could fill. No one ever mentioned her name, not aloud, at least. They spoke of her in hushed tones, in whispers, that crawled through the narrow hallways of the orphanage like shadows. It was as though the very mention of her name invited some nameless horror, a thing that none dared to confront. Yet all could feel pressing against them. Elias shifted uncomfortably. In his seat, his eyes traced the intricate stained glass windows, where the light from the setting sun cast long, colorful beams across the stone floor. Thessany depicted angels, their wings spread in eternal flight, their faces siren so serene. It was almost unnatural, but Elias knew the truth of it. Serenity was a mask. Beneath it, darkness thrived. And the silence that followed, Eliza's absence had become its new hymn. He had found her that night before she vanished, before the world had turned its back on her. She had been standing at the window in the attic, her back to him, her red hair like a ribbon of fire against the fading light. There was something about the way she stood, something in the way her shoulders hunched, as if she was waiting for something to come for her. He had thought little of it then, assuming she was just another lonely child, lost in the maze of thoughts only children could understand. "Eliza," he had called out softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. She had turned to face him, her face pale, eyes wide and impossibly deep, as though they held all the old secrets. "Headmaster," she had whispered, and then, as if struck by some unseen force, her eyes flickered to the side, towards the shadows that clung to the farthest corners of the attic. The sound of the bell had told, and her expression twisted, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or understanding passing across her delicate features. Elias had tried to reassure her, to ease the tightness in her chest. With words he no longer believed himself, had told her that everything would be fine, that the darkness she feared was just a trick of the mind. But she hadn't believed him. Her silence had been all things where she needed. The next morning, Eliza was gone, vanished, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. There was no sign, no trace, only the coldness of her absence that seeped into the walls like a slow poison. The bell tolled again, its sound reverberating through the stone, a grim reminder of all that had been lost, all that remained unanswered. Elias shuddered as it rang, feeling the weight of it settle deep into his bones. The bell had tolled for her, just as it had for every child who had entered this place, but it was different this time. Elisa's absence had fractured something within him, something that had been dormant for years. It had been days before anyone spoke of her disappearance aloud. In the days following, the orphanage had seemed quieter, more subdued, as though even the children sensed the shift in the air. The others had moved on, as children do, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But Elias had not moved on. He had spent hours combing through the halls, searching for some sign, some clue to her whereabouts. In the attic, he had found the mark. It was carved into the wooden beam, a deep gouge that ran the length of it, jagged, as though something or someone had scraped it there in desperation. The mark had no meaning, no explanation, but it had felt like a warning, a cryptic symbol that demanded to be understood. "Eliza," Elias murmured again, the name slipping from his lips like a prayer. He had said it once, but it had felt wrong, like calling her name would tie him to her disappearance in a way he could never escape. But the truth was worse. Silence. He could still feel her presence, faint, almost imperceptible, like a mist that clung to the edges of his mind. Eliza's absence had carved a hole within him, a void that whispered in the darkness of the orphanage, filling the spaces where there had once been answers. He had returned to the portrait of the founders more times than he could count. It was the same as always, their faces frozen in time, their eyes filled with some hollow sanctity. But Eliza's face was missing. The gap where her likeness should have been seemed to mock him, to twist the truth of what he had seen, what had happened. The bell tolled again. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady as he walked down the aisle towards the altar, his eyes fixed on the emptiness where Eliza's name should have been. Her absence was like a wound in the fabric of the orphanage, a wound that could not be healed, a wound that had begun to fester, spreading its poison into the very heart of the institution. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, the last light of the day fading into a cold, indifferent dusk. Their children had long since gone to bed, their soft breathing the only sound that filled the silence of the chapel. But the silence was not empty. It was thick with the weight of things left unsaid, things that lingered just beyond the reach of understanding. Elias could feel it pressing against him, the oppressive darkness that seemed to wait for him, for the moment when Hewald finally faced the truth that had been buried so long ago. He looked once more at the portrait, the faces staring back at him, with eyes that seemed to accuse. The absence of Eliza haunted him, like a shadow that would never let him go. He knew deep in his bones that her disappearance was the key to everything. The orphanage, its dark secrets, the bells that tolled with such finality, everything was bound to her. And yet, even now, he could not speak her name aloud, not in prayer, not in truth. Her name was a crack in thistlelands, and to speak it would shatter everything he had tried to protect. But the bell tolled once more, its sound like a question that had no answer, and Elias knew, in that moment, that the truth of Eliza's disappearance was something he would never escape. The shadows in the chapel seemed to stretch, to draw closer, as the last of the daylight bled away, and in the stillness, the unspoken name of Eliza lingered, a whisper that would never fade. The river had always been quiet, but its silence was not one of peace. It was the kind of quiet that lingers, heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. The river, winding through the town like a dark artery, had witnessed more than it would ever tell. It had swallowed secrets in its depths, fed them to the stones that lay beneath its murky surface. Most who lived near it had learned not to ask what it held, but the river had its own memory, one that could not be erased. It was early morning when Thelator was found, its edges curling from the moisture of the river's touch, its contents hidden beneath a veil of silt. The water had carried it gently to Thebunk, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. The letter was Mel, a child's handwriting scrawled in fragile, shaky strokes. The ink had balled in places, as though it had been written in haste, in fear, in desperation. Margaret had been the one to discover it. She had walked to the river's edge every morning, drawn by some inexplainable force, as though the water itself was calling her. She knew the river, had always known it, from the days when she was a child. But today, Ask reached down to pick up the letter. Something about it unsettled her. She held it in her hands, the wet paper slipping between her fingers. It was stained, the marks of the river's passage like fingerprints from the past. And yet something inside her compelled her. Walls cold, its pews empty, its silence oppressive. There had always been something about this place, something that gnawed at her heart like an unanswered question. Her fingers brushed the edge off the altar, tracing the delicate carvings that had long since lost their luster. She had come to this place many times before, seeking answers in the quiet refuge of the church. But now, she was no longer here to pray or seek solace. She was here to uncover what had been hidden, what had been buried beneath the weight of time and guilt. She could feel it, the heavy pull off something buried deep beneath her feet, something that had remained sealed away for far too long. The chapel had been built on secrets, on lies, and the truth was just beneath the surface, beneath the floorboards, beneath the walls, beneath the stone. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if urging her to move forward, to confront what had been hidden. Her eyes flickered to the floor, the worn wooden planks beneath her feet. There had always been a place there, a space that seemed off, a place that had never quite fit with the rest of the chapel. The boards groaned in protest. As she knelt, her fingers searching the crevices between the planks, the dust settling like the ashes of forgotten sun. It was then that her fingers brushed against something cold, something metal. a latch dot, her breath caught in her throat as she pried at the hidden door, her heart hammering in her chest. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the silence deeper, as though the very chapel was holding its breath, waiting. The door resisted at first, but with a soft creak it gave way, revealing a narrow, dark passage beneath the floor. A cold draught rose from the depths, the smell of mildew and earth clinging to the air, like a scent of something long dead. Madeline hesitated, her gaze flickering down the darkened shaft. Her heart thudded in her chest, a mix of dread and anticipation, curling like smoke in her mind. She had never thought to look here. She had never dared to imagine what lay below. But now, as the wind howled outside, as the storm raged against the walls, she knew there was no turning back. The truth had been buried here, waiting to be uncovered. With a deep breath, she descended the narrow staircase, her hand gripping the damp stone wall for support. The passage was cramped, the air thick with dust, and the scent of decay. Each step echoed in the silence, the sound reverberating like a drumbeat in the dark. The walls seemed to close in around her, the stone cool against her skin, the shadows pressing against her like a living thing. At the bottom of the stairs, Thea grew colder still, the chill creeping into her bones. The crypt stretched out before her, the walls lined with shelves of decaying wooden crates, old records, and faded ledgers. The remnants of the orphanage's history lay stacked here, like forgotten tombstones, piled high and abandoned. The dust hung in Thea, thick as fog, settling over everything, burying it deeper in time's grasp. Madeline stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She moved toward the nearest crate, her fingers strumbling as she pried open the lid. Inside, the yellowed pages of old records lay scattered, their ink blurred by time and moisture, the writing nearly. She shuffled through the papers, her eyes scanning the names, knew all too well. Names of the children who had passed through the orphanage, who had been forgotten by the world, erased from the records from memory. But it was the last crate that caught her attention, the one pushed into the farthest corner of the crypt, nearly hidden from view. She approached it, her heart racing as she reached forth lid. It opened with a soft creak, the sound like a sigh of resignation, as if the crypt itself had known this moment was inevitable. Inside, the final records lay waiting, wrapped in a thick layer of dust. She pulled them out, the weight of them heavy. In her hands, the pages were brittle, yellowed with age, but they had been preserved for this moment, preserved for her. She opened the first page with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words. The name that greeted her was one she had never expected to find. Eliza. Her breath caught in her throat. The final child, the one whose name had been lost, erased from the orphanage's philosophical records, the one whose disappearance had haunted her every step. Eliza had been the first to vanish, the first to slip through the cracks of the orphanage's carefully constructed walls. And now, here she was, her name written in ink that had long since bled over time, forever etched into the forgotten history of the institution. But it was not just Eliza's name that made Madeline's heart seize. As she turned the page, the truth became clear, the truth that had been hidden beneath the floorboards all this time. The children had never been lost, they had been taken by the very hands that were supposed to protect them. The orphanage had not been a place of salvation, it had been a cage trap, designed to ensnare the souls of the innocent, to feed off their fear, their pain, their silence. The records told a story of corruption, of a twisted ritualistic system that had used the children as pawns in a darker game. Madeline's hands shook violently as she read, her mind struggling to comprehend the weight of what she was discovering. She had always known there was something wrong with the orphanage, something that had gnawed at her from the very beginning. But she had never imagined that the very foundation of the institution she had once believed in had been built on lies, on manipulation, on death. A cold chill swept over her, a wave of nausea rising in her chest. The walls of the crypt seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the stench of rot, of decay. She wanted to look away, to run, to bury the records back where they belonged, and forget of everything. But the truth was there, staring back at her, and it was impossible to ignore. The final child's name, Eliza's name, was not just the first to be erased. It was the final marker of a twisted history, the last fragment of a story that had never been told, never been allowed to see the light of day. Eliza had been the key, the one who had knocked the door to a nightmare that Madeline had been blind to, a nightmare a thought had been unfolding in the very halls she had once walked, A nightmare thought had been hidden beneath the chapel floor. Her pulse quickened, the weight of revelation crashing over her. The storm above seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder, the walls of the crypt groaning in response, as though the entire building was coming alive, awakening to the truth that had been buried for so long. And in that moment, as she stood the heart of the crypt, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Madeline knew nothing would ever be the same. The truth had been uncovered, and there was no escaping it now. The wind had picked up as Madeline stood at the edge of the hill, watching the silhouette of the bell tower against the darkening sky. The town stretched out below her, its houses scattered like bones in the twilight. The once bustling streets were empty now, the air still and heavy, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The silence was deafening, but the bell tower had not forgotten its duty. It tolled again, the sound reverberated through hills, a deep mournful chime that echoed like a wound opening in throat. Madeline's heart clenched as the tolling reached her ears. It was a sound she had known too well, a sound that had haunted her every step. The bell had always been a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been buried, but no, it was different. This time it tolled for everything. The town had forgotten its children. They had been erased, their names slipping from the records, like dust blown away by the wind. But Madeline could not forget. She had spent years searching for answers, for the truth, and now it was as if the bell had once marked the passing of time in this place, was acknowledging theism that had been committed. The bell knew the truth, and it was telling her no, as it always had. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, as though the heavens themselves had decided to weep for what had been done. The water pooled around her feet, soaking her boots as she stepped forward, her breath quick and shallow. She could feel the weight of Italy, the weight of the years, the weight of the lies, the weight of their children's silent cries. Behind her, in the shadows of Thetown, others had gathered, drawn to the bell's toll. They, too, felt its pull, felt the presence of something ancient, something that had been buried for far too long. They were not children of the orphanage, but they were children of town, and they, too, carried the weight of its sins, the sins of silence, the sins of forgetting. The bell tolled again. Each chime was a shard of glass, cutting through the air, sharp and insistent. The sound rumbled in her chest, reverberating through her bones, sinking deep into her soul. She had never realized how much power the bell held. It was not just a relic of the past, it was a living thing, a reminder that some stories are never truly buried. She could feel the children now, their eyes watching her, their faces drifting in and out of her vision like ghosts. They were not gone. They had never been gone. They had lived and died in the walls of this town, their voices swallowed by the silence. But now, their voices were rising again, carried on the wind, on the sound of the bell. She turned toward the orphanage, the building looming in the distance, its darkened windows like empty eyes staring back at her. It had been abandoned years ago, its walls crumbling, its foundations sinking into the earth. The children were gone, but the legacy of their suffering remained, hidden beneath the chapel floor, buried in the crypt, carried in the very stones of the town. The last toll of the bell echoed through the air, long and deep, reverberating against the mountains, a sound that would never fade. And in that moment, Madeline realized something that had been growing in the pit of her stomach, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of everything she had uncovered. The truth was not just a memory, it was a living thing, gnawing at the present, feeding on the silence. The bell had tolled for their children. It had tolled for the ones who had vanished, for the ones who had been forgotten, for the ones who had been erased. But it was not just for them, it was for the town too, for the people who had stood by and done nothing. Fourth ones who had turned away from the truth when it had been right in front of them. The past was not just something that could be buried. The sins of the orphanage were not just the sins of those who had come before her. They were the sins of the whole town, the sins of their fathers, of the mothers, of the ones who had hidden their eyes behind their hands, who had turned away when the cries became too loud. The wind howled, the rain whipping against her face, but Madeline stood firm, her gaze fixed on the rumbling orphanage in the distance. The storm raged around her, but she did not flinch. The past had come for her, and there was no escaping it now. The others were beginning to leave, their heads bowed, their shoulders hunched beneath the weight of their own complicity. They had heard the bell. They had felt the truth settle upon them like dust, like rot. But Madeline did not move. She could not move. She had spent so long running from this moment, from the truth, and now it had found her. Now it was impossible to escape. The bell tolled again, its sound like a final breath, a last chime that reverberated through the hills and into the very heart of the town. It was a sound that could not be unheard. It was a sound that would echo in the minds of everyone who had heard it. A reminder that the sins of the past were not so easily forgotten. And in that moment, Madeline understood. The bell had tolled for them all. The orphanage was gone, but its legacy lived on. The children's silent cries had never truly stopped. They had never been buried. They had simply waited. And now, as the last toll of Theobald faded into the storm, Madeline realized that some stories are never truly buried. They live on in the echoes of the past, in the cracks of the walls, in the hearts of those who hear them. The bell had tolled, and Thestry had been told. It would never be forgotten. The wind howled against the windows of the orphanage, the old glass, rattling in its panes as though it too sought to break free from the walls that held it prisoner. The shadows and thickeners of the room stretched long and thin, like fingers creeping over the floorboards, seeking something lost. The night was thick with a kind of stillness, a heaviness in the air that made the heart race, and outside, the storm raged, but inside, the orphanage was silent. Madeline stood in the forgotten chapel, her back against the cold stone walls, her hands trembling as they traced the dust-covered pews. The faint scent of incense lingered, mingling with the musty air of the room, and it felt as though the chapel itself had been asleep for years, its prayers unheard, its songs unsung. There was a stillness here that seemed wrong, as if the very building had been holding its breath for something it knew was coming. Her eyes drifted over the space, scanning the dim corners until they fell upon the old hymnal. It was wedged beneath the altar, half hidden by the rotting wood of the lectern, as though it had been abandoned in haste. The book's cover was faded, its edges frayed with time, its pages yellowed and fragile. Yet, something drew her to it, something she could not explain, a compulsion that tugged at her like an unseen hand. She approached the altar slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the dusty book. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting, as though it had once belonged to her. She hesitated for a moment, the past flooding her thoughts, those dark days when the children had still been here, their voices filling the air with hymns and prayers that now seemed so distant, so unreal. What had happened to them, to their voices? With a soft sigh, Madeline opened the hymnal, its pages crackling beneath her touch. The first few pages were filled with words she recognized, hymns sung by the children, words of devotion and worship, songs meant to bring peace to their restless hearts. But the deeper she turned, the more she realized something was wrong. The hymns were not just songs. They were prayers for the lost, for the forgotten, prayers that the town had refused to hear, prayers that no one had ever answered. The words were simple at first, familiar in their rhythm, but then they began to twist. They became frantic, desperate, as though the very ink had bled with sorrow. One hymn read, "We are lost, and none will come. The walls close in, the shadows grow. Pray for us, O Lord, for we are forgotten, we are alone." Madeline's breath caught in her throat, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages faster, the words growing more urgent, more pained. She could almost hear the children singing, their voices trembling in the darkness, crying out for salvation, for someone to come and hear their pleas. The final hymn, written in a scrawl so frantic it seemed to tear at the page itself, read, "The bell tolls, but no one listens. We are buried beneath the stone, beneath the chapel, beneath the ground. Come for us, come and set us free." A chill crawled up Madeline's spine. Her mind raced, but her body was frozen. Her hands pressed against the old hymnal, as though she were holding something sacred, something that could never be returned. The children had prayed, they had begged for release, but no one had ever heard, no one had ever come for them. She closed the book with a slow, deliberate motion, the weight of it too much to bear any longer. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like the lost children's cries, rattling the walls, shaking the very foundation of the orphanage. It felt as though the house itself was alive, as though it were remembering what had been done, what had been left unsaid. Madeline's breath quickened, her chest tightening with the realization of what she had uncovered. The children's voices had never been lost, not really. They had been buried beneath the floorboards, beneath the chapel, beneath the earth itself, but their cries had never stopped. They had never been answered, and now, The truth was laid bare. The orphanage had been a prison, a cage that had trapped their souls long after their bodies had disappeared. And the town, the people who had once walked these streets, had forgotten them, had forgotten their cries. The bell tolled again, distant, mournful, its chime carrying through the night like a death knell. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. She had known the sound. She had always known the toll of the bell, its rhythm embedded deep in her memory. But this time, the sound seemed different, heavier, as though it had heard the children's prayers, as though it had felt the weight of their suffering. The bell was not just marking time, it was marking something deeper. It was marking the end of their silence. Madeline's gaze lifted, her eyes tracing the path of the bell tower above. The tower was silent now, its stones weathered and cracked, but she could feel it, the weight of the past, the weight of the children's souls still caught in the walls. The bell had tolled, but it had not stopped the suffering. It had only acknowledged it. The truth of the children's fate would never be erased. It had been carved into the very bones of this place. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her thoughts swirling, her heart racing with a fear she could not name. She had wanted the truth, had longed for answers, but now that she had them, they only brought more questions, more terror. The children's prayers had never been heard, but now, Madeline could hear them. She could feel them, like a cold breath against her skin. They were not gone. They had never been gone. The hymnal, the prayers, the toll of the bell, everything had led her here, to this moment, to this realization that the children were not simply forgotten. They were bound to this place, to the echoes of their suffering, and as much as the town had buried them, as much as the town had buried its sins, the truth could never be fully erased. Her hands gripped the hymnal tighter, the edges of the pages rough against her skin. She could not stay here any longer. She could not remain in the chapel, in the prison of the past. But she could not leave, not yet. The bell was still tolling, its final chimes ringing through the air, the sound lingering long after it had faded. The children's voices echoed in her mind, and she knew that some stories, some cries, could never be buried. Madeline turned and left the chapel, the storm raging outside. But the sound of the bell lingered in the air, a promise that would never fade. The children's silent cries would never be forgotten, not by her, not by anyone who had heard them. The wind carried with it a chill, one that seemed to seep into the bones of the town, crawling through the cracks in the streets, through the alleyways, and beneath the proud facades of well-kept homes. Madeline walked through the streets, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth, but the wind, relentless and omnipresent, spoke louder than her steps ever could. It was the voice of something ancient, something buried, something that refused to stay silent. The town was beautiful, of course, the kind of beauty that whispered of prosperity, of an order kept intact for generations. The streets were lined with elegant stone houses, their windows gleaming beneath the pale sky. The markets bustled with life, the clink of coins and the chatter of vendors filling the air. But Madeline felt it, that ever-present weight, that suffocating silence underneath the surface, like a veil stretched to thin over something far darker. And in that silence, the wind carried the whispers. She could hear them now, as she walked down the main thoroughfare, her gaze fixed ahead. The soft, distant laughter of children, a sound that was not of the living, a sound that belonged to another time, a time when the orphanage still stood at the edge of the town, before its secrets had been buried and its walls left to decay. The laughter rose and fell on the breeze, teasing her, pulling her further into the labyrinth of memories that had once been a place of refuge and now stood as a hollow echo of lost innocence. Madeline paused, her hand pressed to her chest as though she could stop the beating of her heart, as though she could stop the memories that were rising with each step. The sound of children's laughter was everywhere, and yet there were no children in sight, none but the shadows, the ghosts, that lingered just beyond the veil of her perception. They followed her as she moved, darting in and out of view like fleeting memories, whispers of those who had vanished, whose names had been erased, whose lives had been stolen by the very hands meant to protect them. She crossed through the square, the wind tugging at the edges of her coat, pulling her toward the church that stood at the heart of the town. The bell tower, dark and imposing, loomed above the buildings, its spire reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing to the heavens. The wind seemed to focus its energy around the church, making the air thick, charged. It felt alive. It felt as if it was breathing, drawing in the history of the town, the weight of its sins. The laughter echoed again, clearer this time, rising, from the depths of her memory, from places she had hoped were buried forever. Elias, she thought. Sister Agnes, the children. Their names floated through her mind like fragments of a broken puzzle, pieces she had never been able to put together. What had happened to them? To the ones who had vanished? To the ones who had prayed for a savior, for someone to hear their voices? The town had moved on, had buried the past beneath a thick layer of denial, but the wind would never forget. The children's voices would never be silenced. Madeline's eyes moved toward the church, and she felt an irresistible pull to it. Her feet carried her toward the entrance, drawn not by faith, but by something darker, something primal. The laughter faded as she reached the steps, but the weight of it remained, like the echo of footsteps that had long since disappeared. The doors of the church were ajar, as if waiting for her, inviting her in. She pushed them open, the creaking sound of the ancient wood reverberating through the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and incense, a scent that reminded her of the orphanage, of the prayers that had been whispered in this very space, prayers that had never been answered. The pews were empty, save for the shadows that stretched long across the stone floor, dark and empty, just like the prayers that had been offered here. The bell tower loomed above, its ceiling arched high, reaching toward the heavens, but it was not the grandeur of the church that caught Madeline's attention. It was the altar that had once been the heart of the sanctuary, where the children had knelt, where they had prayed for salvation. Now, it was nothing but a relic, untouched by the years, stained with the shadows of what had occurred beneath its gaze. The laughter rose again, this time louder, more insistent. She could almost hear the words now, whispered faintly in the wind, barely audible. "We are still here. We are still waiting." Madeline's breath caught in her throat as the truth of it settled upon her, heavy and suffocating. The children had never left. Their spirits, their voices, had been trapped here, within these walls, within the bones of the town. The wind seemed to swirl around her now, gusting through the open doors, stirring the air, as if it were pushing her toward something, toward the bell tower. Madeline's feet moved on their own, carrying her toward the base of the tower, where the narrow staircase spiraled upward into the dark. She had never ventured up there before, not since, not since that day. The day when everything had changed. The day when the bell had tolled one last time, and the children had vanished into the night. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell as she ascended, each step creaking under her weight. The wind howled louder as she climbed, the sound rushing through the gaps in the stone, as if the tower itself were crying out, mourning what had been lost. She reached the top, and the view from the tower window was stark, desolate. The town stretched out below, its streets empty, its buildings quiet, but in the distance she could see the outline of the orphanage, still standing, its windows dark and empty. Madeline stood at the top of the tower, the wind whipping around her, the howling sound filling her ears, and she realized, with a sharp, terrible clarity, that the town would never be free of the past. The children's laughter would never fade, not as long as the wind continued to blow, not as long as the bell continued to toll. And then, as though answering her realization, the bell tolled once more, deep and resonant, shaking the very foundation of the tower. The sound of it filled her ears, filled her chest, filling every corner of her being. The bell was calling out, not for the dead, but for the living, for the town, for the sins that had never been repented. It was a call to remember, a call to confront the past, to face the truth that had been buried beneath layers of silence and lies. As the final chime echoed into the night, Madeline felt it, a coldness, a weight, something that pressed against her heart. She wasn't alone. She never had been. The children were here, in the wind, in the walls, in the very town itself. Their voices had never stopped. They would never stop. The bell tolled one last time, and Madeline knew that no matter how hard the town tried to bury the past, no matter how many years passed, the children would remain waiting, watching, calling out in the wind. Some stories, some cries, could never be forgotten. The town was quiet now, the streets bathed in the sickly glow of dusk as the last light of the day drained from the sky. The wind had calmed, but the air was heavy with the residue of the storm, thick with the scent of wet earth and something older, something deeper, that lingered beneath it all. Madeline stood at the window of her small room, looking out toward the orphanage, its outline barely visible in the distance. The memory of it, the dark stone, the broken windows, the empty halls had not faded. It never would. Nothing ever truly fades. Her reflection stared back at her, faintly, in the glass. The lines of age and sorrow etched deeper on her face than they had been just months ago. Time had been relentless, stripping away the last remnants of the woman she had once been. The woman who had believed in the purity of good intentions, in the safety of the world she thought she knew. But that was before the truth had come, relentless and raw, tearing through everything she had held close, unraveling it in the space of a few breaths. The children were gone, their bodies swallowed by the earth, their voices swallowed by the walls. The town had buried them, had buried everything, and now they were nothing more than stories, whispers that faded when the wind blew. But Madeline knew the truth. She had seen the hymnal, she had heard the bell toll, she had uncovered the secrets beneath the chapel floor, and now, standing here, looking out into the growing night, she realized that there was no catharsis. There was no final peace to be found. The orphanage was gone, the children were gone, and yet everything that had happened, the terrible decisions, the years of silence would never truly fade. It would linger, it would always be here, in the silence, in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the town's veneer of order, of prosperity. It lived in the cracks of the streets, in the forgotten corners of the market, in the whispers of those who passed by. The truth that had been buried, tucked away behind the facades of this place, would always find a way to rise again. Not in words, not in actions, but in the silence that followed the revelation. The silence that clung to the town like a shroud. Madeline's hand pressed against the window, her fingers tracing the cold glass, feeling the chill of it against her skin, and she knew the silence is its own kind of truth. It was not a truth that could be erased, not one that could be buried beneath layers of time or denial. The story, the real story of what had happened here, would never be forgotten, not as long as the wind blew through the town, not as long as the children's voices echoed in the stillness. The town had tried to forget, it had tried to move on, to pretend that the orphanage had never existed, that the children had never been there, that the bell had never tolled for them. But the truth was inescapable. The bell had tolled for all of them, and the children they had never truly left. Madeline's gaze drifted toward the hills, toward the distant shape of the orphanage. The buildings that had once stood so proud were now crumbling, hollowed out by time and neglect, their windows dark, their doors sealed shut. But still, she could feel it, the weight of all that had happened here. The children's laughter, the cries of those who had disappeared, the prayers whispered in vain, all of it had been locked inside, entombed in this place, and it would never be freed. The town had built its wealth on silence, on the pretense that nothing had happened, that nothing was wrong. The townsfolk had swept the past beneath their feet, tucked it away behind the walls of the orphanage, behind the closed doors of their homes, and pretended it didn't exist. But they had never truly forgotten. How could they? The wind itself carried their sins, carried the whispers of those who had been lost to the earth. The wind was the voice of the children, calling out to the ones who had left them behind. Madeline exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the glass as she stared into the night. The wind picked up again, swirling round the corners of the room, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter. It was distant, fleeting, like the ghosts of the children who had once been here, whose stories had never been told, whose names had never been spoken aloud. The laughter was hollow, like a memory that was fading, but it remained. Always, it remained. The sound of it twisted and turned in the air, like a song that had been forgotten, but whose refrain would never truly leave. Her reflection in the window seemed to blur as the tears she had been holding back slipped silently down her cheeks. She had found the truth. She had unearthed it from the depths of the past, from the walls of the orphanage, from the pages of the hymnal, from the tolling of the bell. But the truth had not brought relief. It had not freed her from the weight of the years. It had only deepened the horror, deepened the ache in her chest. The town had buried its sins, and Madeline had helped unearth them. But in the end, there was no peace, no justice, no resolution. The only thing left was the silence that would remain unbroken, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many generations moved on. The silence that would always carry the story of the orphanage, of the children, of the town's darkest secrets. She turned away from the window, her heart heavy in her chest, her feet moving on their own accord. She had never truly been able to escape this place. The orphanage, the town, the memories, they all lived within her, in the silence that followed the revelation, in the echo of the children's voices, It was a story that would never fade, a truth that could never be buried. Madeline's footsteps echoed in the hall as she walked away from the window. But the laughter, the faint, distant laughter followed her. It was always there, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, lived on in the silence that would haunt the town forever. To read, the handwriting was erratic, a child's unpracticed script, but the words were clear enough. "Help me, they are coming for me. I am alone. The others, they are not the same. I hear them in the night, in the walls. Please help me. Please don't let them find me." Margaret's fingers trembled as read, her heart beginning to pound. Who had written this? A child. There was no name, no clue as to who might have been in danger, or why they had been left to send such a desperate cry, lost to the river's embrace. She looked at the handwriting again. The ink blurred as if the child had been shaking, perhaps crying, and yet there was no mention of the child in the orphanage, no sign of their existence in the years she had worked there. Combing through the history of the children who had passed through its doors, she folded the letter carefully, as if it might disintegrate if she handled it too roughly, and tucked it into her pocket. The air around her was still, not even the wind stirred. The river lapped gently at the bank, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple, but it seemed darker now, deeper, as though the water itself had been changed by the words it had carried. The orphanage sat atop the hill, its silhouette framed against the rising sun. From the river's edge, it looked ancient, weathered, as though it had borne witness to far more than it had been meant to hold. Inside, the walls had grown thick with silence. The children who remained were quieter now, their eyes wide and vacant, as though something had stolen their voices. Margaret climbed the hill slowly, her mind heavy with the letter's contents. She had heard stories about the orphanage's past, whispers of things that had been swept away, buried under layers of time. The bell tower, the chimes that rang too loudly, too often, the missing children, the ones whose names had never made it into the records, whose disappearances were glossed over, their memories lost in the fold of the institution's history. But this letter, so fragile, so desperate, felt different. It was a cry that reached across the years, dragging with it something forgotten, something that had never truly been left behind. As she approached the doors of the orphanage, the air grew heavier, the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She paused before the entrance, a strange unease swirling within her. The doors creaked open with an almost unnatural slowness, as though the building itself was reluctant to let her in. The halls were cold, too cold for the time of year, and the shadows seemed to stretch, elongating across the stone floors, as though they were reaching for her. Inside, the children moved like ghosts, their pale faces staring out from beneath the flicker of candlelight. None of them looked up as she passed, their eyes hollow, empty of the innocence they should have held. It was a stillness that permeated the entire place, a suffocating quiet that had settled over the orphanage, like a blanket of dust. Margaret made her way to the headmaster's office. The door was ajar, and through the crack, she could see, sitting at his desk, his face drawn and pale. He looked up as she entered, his eyes weary but guarded. There was something about his expression, something she could not place, that sent a chill down her spine. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse, as though he had not spoken in days. "What brings you here?" She took a step closer, her hand still resting on the letter in her pocket. She hesitated, unsure of how to. The words felt too heavy, too dangerous to speak aloud. "I found something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A letter." It came from the river. Elias's eyes flickered, a brief shadow passing across his face. He stood, slowly, as if the weight of her words had settled into his bones. "A letter," he repeated, his voice too calm, too steady. "What did it say?" Margaret pulled the letter from her pocket, unfolding it carefully. She handed it to him, her heart racing in her chest. He took it without a word, his fingers brushing over the fragile paper, as though it were a relic, something precious, something dangerous. As he read, his face grew paler, the color draining from his cheeks. "This ... double quotes," Elias murmured, his voice shaking. "This was never meant to be found." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, her voice rising in a mixture of fear and confusion. "Who wrote it? What is happening here?" Elias turned the letter over, his gaze lingering on the empty space where a name should have been. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, before he spoke again, his voice a mere whisper. "It was her," he said. "Eliza. She was the first to disappear. The name hit Margaret like a blow to the chest. Eliza, the girl with the fire-colored hair, the one whose name had never been spoken aloud, the one who had vanished before anyone had known she was gone, the one who had left behind a letter in the river, a letter that should never have been found. The truth that had been buried for so long was surfacing now, like a dark tide creeping over the shore. Thuriver had carried it to them, but it would not let them forget. Not now, not ever. The silence returned, heavier than before, and as Elias lowered his head, his eyes staring at the floor, Margaret knew that the river had brought something else with it, a reckoning, something that could not be undone, and it was coming for them all. The nursery stood untouched. Amacilium, 2 lives that had once filled its cradles with laughter, with breath, with song. The air was thick, stagnant, as though the walls themselves could not bear to release what had once been so vibrant within them. The wallpaper, once a soft pastel, now curled and peeled like the pages of a forgotten book. The patterns faded, the colors swallowed by time and neglect. There were no more children here. The cradles stood empty, the rocking chairs silent, their wooden frames hollowed by years of absence. Madeline had not intended to come here, yet somehow her feet had carried her to the door. Her hand reaching out, turned the tarnished knob as though it were an old friend, a memory she couldn't let go of. The nursery had been the heart of the orphanage, once a place where the children had been tucked into bed, where their small voices had filled the air with lullabies, their songs fluttering like fragile moths in the quiet of night. But now there was only the silence, the oppressive silence, that sat heavy on the air, that pressed down on her shoulders like dust. She stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene before her. The dim light of late afternoon filtered through the cracked windows, casting thin beams across the room, making the dust in the air glow like particles of lost him. It was as if the room had not aged at all, yet it had been frozen in armament long gone. The cradles sat in their corners, untouched, the empty bedding still tucked neatly inside. The rocking chairs stood still, their backs arched like ancient statues, mourning the absence of their former use. The air in the room held aimry faint, like the echo of a song that had not been sung in years. Madeline necklaced her eyes for a moment, her hands trembling at her sides. She could almost hear it, a lullaby, the soft lilting notes drifting from somewhere far away, like the distant murmur of a forgotten dream. Her mother had sung her toeslip with that song when she was a child, had sung it to all of them, in those rare moments when the world felt safe, before the darkness had taken hold. But the song faded quickly, slipping away like the last breath of a dying ember. When Madeline opened her eyes again, the room was still, the silence pressing in on her, heavier now, suffocating. She crossed the room slowly, her feet dragging across the floorboards, their groans echoing in the stillness. She felt something behind her in the shadows, something watching her, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Only the empty cradles, the forgotten toys, the remnants of a time that had been swallowed whole. A single tear fell, slipping down her cheek and dropping silently onto the floor. It was an inexplicable thing, that tear, as though it had been waiting to escape for years, too heavy to be held back any longer. She knelt down, her fingers brushing the cold wood of Thefla, tracing the faint scratches that marred its surface. There had been children here, once. There had been laughter. There had been joy. But all that remained was the silence, and the emptiness that echoed louder than anything else. Madeline stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping over the room again, her eyes lingering on the cradles. She could almost see them, the children, their small faces peering out from behind Thebes, their eyes wide with innocence, their voices singing softly and But where had they gone? What had happened to them? The orphanage had always been a place of refuge, of safety, or so they had told them. But what had it become since then? What had it hidden beneath its walls? The children had disappeared, one by one, their names slipping from the records like they had never existed at all. No one spoke of them anymore. No one asked where they had gone. It was as though they had never been there at all. But Madeline remembered. She remembered their faces, their voices, the way they had clung to her when they were frightened, the way they had looked at her with those wide, trusting eyes. She had promised them she would keep them safe. She had promised, and yet now they were gone, vanished into the air, into the silence, leaving behind only empty cradles and peeling wallpaper. Her fingers brushed the edge of phone of the cradles, and she felt the sudden weight of it, the weight of the years that had passed, the weight of the memories that had been buried beneath layers of dust and time. She could feel the loss now, like a hollow space inside her, a place that could never be filled. The children were gone, and Shehad failed them. A soft creak sounded from somewhere behind her, and she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty, still silent, but as she looked closer, she saw a small, tattered blanket, half hidden beneath the edge of one of the It was old, worn, the edges frayed, but there was something something that called to her. She reached down, her fingers brushing their fabric, and as she pulled it out from beneath the cradle, something shifted in the air, as if the room had been holding its breath. The blanket was stained, the fabric torn in places, but it was not the blanket itself that caught her attention. It was the small handwritten note that had been tucked inside, folded carefully as though someone had been trying to hide it, to keep it. Frombung found Madeline's hands shook as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the faded, uneven handwriting. "Please, we can't stay here anymore. The walls are listening. We can hear them moving at night. Don't forget us. Don't let them take us. If you can, come for us, please." The words hit her like a wave, her breath catching in her throat. The note was a plea, a desperate cry from the children who had once been here, the ones who had vanished without a trace. But why had it been hidden here, in this forgotten corner of the nursery? Ho had written it, and why had no one ever found it before? Madeline's hands trembled as she held the note, the weight of it settling on her shoulders like a stone. She had been the one to carry the memories of this place, the one who had promised to keep the children safe. But she had failed. They had vanished, one by one. And no, their voices were lost, their cries fading into the walls. And yet, the note remained. A final plea from the children, a reminder of all that had been forgotten, all that had been buried. The lullaby lingered in the air, faint and distant, as though it was coming from somewhere far away. The walls seemed to remember the voices that had once filled them, the songs that had been sung in the darkness. But the children were gone. They had been swallowed the silence, by the shadows, and Madeline was left standing alone in the hollow nursery, the empty cradles and the peeling wallpaper staring back at her. A single tear fell again, a silent echo of all that had been lost, all that had never been found. Elias Becker knelt alone in the chapel, the stone floor cold beneath his trembling knees, his back arched not in prayer, but in an unnatural rigidity, as though he feared that the act of bowing, even before God, would break him further. The chapel, too, felt broken, its walls cracked with age, the altar draped in frayed cloth, that fluttered weakly in the draught, as if the building itself had long since lost strength to stand. The air was thick with the scent of old incense, a lingering shadow of prayers once uttered with fervor, now reduced to nothing more than a fading ritual. The stained glass above him let in a dull, faded light, casting grotesque reflections of saints and angels whose faces seemed to twist in agony, rather than peace. Their eyes on Césarine now seemed to follow him with accusing glances, as though they could see the sin that lay buried deep in his heart. Elias could feel their gaze, and closed his eyes tighter, as if the darkness behind his lids might offer him some sanctuary, some reprieve from the overwhelming weight of his own thoughts. The bell tolled in the distance, a slow, rhythmic sound that echoed in the epitaph, his stomach like the death knell of his own soul. He had long abandoned the notion of salvation. The confession that hung on his lips had never been spoken aloud. He had never uttered the words to an soul, perhaps because, deep down, he feared that to speak them would cause everything he had built to crumble into dust. Perhaps because there was no absolution for him, not in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of the children, not in the eyes of anyone who had once trusted him. The orphanage, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a cage, its iron bars, hidden behind through-walls, behind the stained glass, behind the smiles of the children. It had never been a place of salvation, it had been a place of captivity, a place where he had bound himself just as tightly as he had bound the lives of those children. And the truth, the ugly truth, came rushing back now. Memories that old have remained buried, rising like vomit in his throat. He had stood at the head of a Telva orphanage, the children, the illusion of safety. He had thought himself a savior, a protector of the lost, but he had failed. Worse, he had aided in their suffering, whether by omission or by deed. The children, he could see their faces now, their frightened eyes peering from the shadows, from behind the crumbling walls of the institution he had allowed to fester. "Eliza," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a confession, like a secret that had been locked away for far too long. The first to disappear, the one whose face he had never diretto draw, the one whose absence had shattered something inside him, though he had never dared admit it, not even to himself. Her disappearance had been the beginning, the crack in the foundation, the signal of the rot that had long since begun to creep through the orphanage's walls. He remembered her small face, the way she had looked at him, wide-eyed, almost trusting, as though he could protect her from whatever it was that haunted the place. But he hadn't. And when she vanished, when she was swallowed by the shadows that lurked in every corner of the building, he did nothing. He had done nothing at all. He had allowed her to be taken, just as he had allowed the others to disappear. One by one, the memories were sharp, jagged pieces of glass cutting through his mind, each one more painful than the last. The children had been terrified, he realized now, terrified in ways he had never understood. He had thought it was the fear of the unknown, of the world beyond the orphanage's gates, but that was not it. No, it was something deeper, something that had seeped into their bones, into their very souls. It was the fear of being trapped. Trapped in the orphanage, trapped in their rooms, not trapped in their lives. They had never been free, not in the way he had believed. He had known. He had known about things that lurked in the shadows of the orphanage, the whispers that floated through the halls at night, the way the children would huddle together in fear when the bell tolled. They feared something more than just the darkness. They feared what they could not see, what they could not name, and he had done nothing to protect them. He had allowed the fear to grow, to fester, to become something that would never be undone. Tears slipped down his cheek, but Elias didn't move to wipe it away. It felt like a penance, that tear, a nutrient manifestation of the guilt he had carried for so long. His hands clenched on the stone floor, the coldness seeping into his skin, but he didn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except the weight of his own regret, the overwhelming pressure of the truth that he had denied for years. His mind shifted again, memories flowing faster now, tumbling over each other like a river breaking its back. The bell tolled again, louder this time, more insistent, as though it was calling him, pulling him into the depths of his own complicity. He saw their faces again, the children, each one a ghost, each one a reminder of his failure. He had failed them all. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing against his chest as he tried to breathe. His thoughts became jumbled, fragmented. He thought of the documents he had buried, the names he had erased from the records, the lives he had ignored. Their children had been lost to time, but they had never really left. They haunted the orphanage still, their voices soft whispers in the walls, their face shadows in the corners of his vision. But no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he knew the truth now. Elias had been the warden of the orphanage, the keeper of the cage, and he had been complicit in the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. He had allowed it all to happen, had turned it a blind eye, had ignored the signs, the screams, the desperation. His soul could not find peace, because it was not meant to. His penance was not yet complete. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes opening, to meet the faded crucifix above the altar. The figure of Christ, beaten and broken, stared down at him with a gaze that was both pitying and condemning. Elias trembled, as though the very weight of the cross, the weight of his sin, had settled on his shoulders. "I am guilty," he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely a breath. "I am guilty, and I will never be forgiven." The silence around him was deafening. The bell tolled once more, its echo lingering in the empty chapel, and Elias knelt there, his soul laid bare, exposed. There was no redemption here, no salvation, no escape, only the truth and the quiet, unyielding weight of his guilt. The wind howled through the trees like a mournful wail, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very marrow of the earth. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, thick and heavy, casting a pall over the land. The storm was coming. It loomed on the horizon, its blackened mass swelling like a beast preparing to strike. The air was thick with the scent of rain, damp earth, and something else, something foul, something old, like the decay of forgotten memories. Madeline stood at the gates of the orphanage, her hands clutching the wrought iron bars, her fingers cold. As she gripped them tight, she hadn't meant to come back, not after everything that had happened, not after the years of silence, the years of questions that had gone inside, but something had pulled her here, some force she couldn't explain. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of the past pressing against her chest like a vice. She could feel the storm in her bones, the electricity in the air, as though the very heavens themselves had decided to cleanse the earth of the sins committed. Beneath their skies, the orphanage loomed ahead of her, its silhouette dark and imposing against the swirling backdrop of the once pristine building now seemed decayed, as though time had eaten away at it, its edges softened by the decay of the years. The windows were clouded, their glass cracked and discolored, and the roof sagged in places, as if the weight of its own secrets had begun to press down upon it, threatening to crush it into the earth. Madeline's breath came in shallow gasps as she gazed at the orphanage, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel the pull of it, the way the building seemed to reach out to her, as though it knew she was coming, as though it had been waiting for her all these years. The storm's approach mirrored the unraveling of her own understanding. Thought long buried began to stir once more, like worms wriggling to the surface of an old, forgotten grave. A flash of lightning split the sky, momentarily lighting up the orphanage in stark, blinding white. In that brief moment, the building seemed to transform, its shadows elongating, twisting into shapes that shouldn't have been possible. It was as if the building itself was alive, its very walls shifting, breathing, pulsing with a sinister rhythm. The image vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the heavy, suffocating air. Madeline's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stay standing. She hadn't realized until now how long she had been away, how much the years had altered her perception. The path to the orphanage had once seemed so clear, so familiar, but now it was obscured, veiled by time, by memories she had long since buried. What had she come here to find? What was it she hoped to uncover? The sound of the storm's approach was deafening, the wind rising to a deafening roar as it rushed toward her, the trees bending and swaying beneath its force. The gates, long neglected, creaked in protest, as if they were warning her to turn back, warning her not to step into the shadow of the orphanage once more. But Madeline didn't move. Shackled, she closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to calm the frantic pulse of her heart. The air was thick, like the weight of 1,000 years pressing down upon her. It was then that she felt it, the sensation that had been creeping up on her all this time, the sensation that something had always been watching, waiting, just out of reach. The orphanage was not empty. It never had been. She could feel it like a living thing, breathing just beyond the veil. With a slow, deliberate motion, Madeline released her grip on the gates. She stepped back, the ground beneath her feet soft with the weight of years of neglect. The wind picked up again, swirling around her, tugging at her clothes, pulling at her hair. She felt the sting of it against her skin, the cool touch of rain, beginning to fall in slow, deliberate drops. And then, just as she began to totter away, a sound reached her ears, a whisper. It was so soft, so faint, Thatch almost didn't hear it, but it was there, clear and unmistakable. A voice, a Keel's voice, speaking her name, Madeline. The name was a thread, pulling her back, pulling her toward the orphanage, toward the secrets it had buried. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be. But the voice came again, Clay's time, as though the child was standing right behind her. Madeline. She spun around, her pulse racing, her hands shaking. The storm had risen to a crescendo now, the wind howling through the trees, the sky darkening, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall. But there was no one there. The path was empty. The only sound was the rush of wind, the crack of thunder, and the distant rumble of the storm. She took a step back, her eyes darting around, searching for the source of the voice. But all she saw was the orphanage, looming dark and silent in the distance. The storm had swallowed Theland, and in its grip, the orphanage seemed more like a monument to something ghost, something forgotten, than a place of refuge. The voice had been real. She knew it, she had heard it, and yet it had come from nowhere. It had come from the very heart of the orphanage, from the place she had once tried to forget. Their children, where had they gone? The ones she had failed, the ones who had been taken, the ones whose voices she could still hear, faintly, in the corners of her mind. Their whispers were the same as the storm's howl. They were lost, Tothworld, but they were not gone. They were still here, still waiting. Another flash of lightning, this time brighter, more intense, and the orphanage seemed to shift again, its shadows stretching toward her like dark fingers reaching through the storm. A chill ran down her spine. The storm was not just a storm, it was something more, something ancient, something tied to the orphanage, to its past, to their children who had lived and vanished within its walls. Madeline's mind raced. Fiskrits of the orphanage were not dead. They had never been buried. They had only been waiting for this moment, the moment when she would return, when Thastorm would break, when the past would come crashing down like thunder. And in that moment, as the wind tore through the trees and the heavens opened above her, Madeline knew the orphanage was not just a place. It was a prison, a place where the children's souls had been trapped, their voices lost in the storm, and she had been complicit in their suffering. The storm raged now, the wind howling through the gates, but Madeline stood still, her eyes fixed on the orphanage, her heart pounding in her chest. The past was no longer buried. It was rising, like the storm itself, and there was no escaping it. The whispers were growing louder, the voices of the lost children, the ones whose names she could never forget, rising from the darkness. They were calling her, and this time, she could not turn away. The orphanage had waited for her return, and now the storm had come to claim them all. Madeline stood before the altar, the dim light filtering through the cracked stained glass, casting warped shadows across the chapel's floor. The air was thick with incense, heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten prayers. The chapel, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb of stone. The town had always excelled at hiding its sins. Layer after layer of respectable facades had been built upon its foundations, each generation adding a fresh coat of bureaucracy, a new layer of polite lies. The streets were lined with homes, the church steeples rising proudly against the sky, and the cobbled roads glistened after the rain, as if to cleanse the very stones of the dirt beneath them. To the outsiders, it was a place of order, of faith, of community. But Madeline knew better now. Beneath the layers, beneath the masks, lay the festering rot of secrets that had been buried too deep for too long. It was said that time heals all, but what they never told her was that it could also obscure them. Wounds buried in the dust of the past, left unexamined and untended. Fester idento, something more dangerous, something alive, something that gnawed at the present, tearing through the walls they had built to keep it hidden. The bell tolled in the distance, the sound like a slow heartbeat echoing through the town. Madeline stood in the shadow of the orphanage, her hands folded at her sides, eyes fixed on thick rumbling edifice before her. The rain had begun to fall again. A steady patter-that beat against the earth like the whispers of the lost children who had once walked these halls. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone, of decay, and beneath that, the unmistakable sting of guilt. Elias had been the headmaster, the orchestrator, the keeper of the lies. He had always appeared so strong, so resolute in his faith. But Madeline knew now there was no salvation for him, not in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of the children he had failed, not in her eyes. The truth of his complicity, the truth of his actions, had unraveled her understanding of everything she thought she knew. She had found the records Stephanol child's name, the ones who had been erased from history, but those documents were not the worst of it. No, what was worse was the slow realization thought. Elias had never been a bystander. He had been a willing participant. His shuns, though clean in appearance, had been stained far deeper than any uncle could have imagined. The children's disappearance, not just the result of neglect. No, they had been planned. Madeline's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She could still hear the voice of that first child, the one who had slipped away unnoticed, swallowed whole by the darkness. Eliza. She could still see the blank eyes of the children who had come after her. How had she ever thought it was mere carelessness? How had she ever believed that Elias had been unaware of their fates? The wind rose, whipping the rain against her face, and for a moment, the cries of the children seemed to blend with the storm, indistinguishable from the howl of the wind. But they were not just memories. No, they were still alive in the walls of the orphanage, still lingering in the spaces between the stone, between the silence. She had come here to find the truth, but now the truth was not simply in the records. It was in the air she breathed, in the very ground beneath her feet. The orphanage itself had been it was a cage made of stone and steel, and the children had been trapped inside it. But Elias had been the architect, the one who had built bars and locked them tight. She could feel the weight of it now, the crushing burden of his sins, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, just as they had suffocated the children. And then she thought of the confession. Elias had spoken nothing of it, not aloud. He had kept the truth buried, locked away in the dark corners of his mind, just as the records had been locked away beneath the chapel floor. But there was no escaping the truth. No, the storm had unearthed it, and as much as Elias might have tried to bury it beneath layers of prayer and good intentions, it had found its way to the surface. Madeline's gaze swept across the crumbling walls of the orphanage, now stained with time's decay, and she felt her stomach churn with something deep and heavy, an emotion so dark it left no room for pity. She could almost hear Elias's voice in her mind, a quiet murmur that drifted through the chapel, praying for forgiveness he did not deserve. He had prayed, but it was too late for redemption. There was no absolution for what he had done, for their children who had vanished into the night, for the ones whose names had been erased, whose lives had been thrown away like scraps of paper. Her breath came quick, sharp as stepped closer to the door of the orphanage. The rain pelted her, but she did not flinch. She had come here for one final reckoning, one last confrontation with the ghosts of the past. The building loomed over her like a dark sentinel, its windows dim, as though the structure itself had come alive, waiting to trap her once more. She pushed open the door, the hinges protesting with a groan. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of rodent mildew. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each step a reminder of heavy, suffocating silence that had filled the halls for so many years. The orphanage had once been filled with laughter, with voices, with life. Now, it was nothing but a mausoleum, the echoes of the past trapped within its walls. The chapel door creaked shut behind her, and she stood in the cold, dim space, listening to the quiet. The pews were empty, the candles long since extinguished, and the altar stood bare, a hollow monument to forgotten faith. But it was not faith that had sustained this place, it was power, the power Elias had wielded over the children, the power of their fear, their trust. He had used their lives as currency in a game, had never intended to lose. Her heart pounded as she looked toward the back of the chapel, where a door once sealed by time and neglect stood ajar. She could feel it, the presence of something long buried, long forgotten. She crossed the room, her footsteps heavy in the silence, her mind racing with the truth. She would never leave here unchanged, not now. In that moment, she realized the depth of it, the realization that her search had always been more than just for the children, for their names, for their fates. She had been searching for herself, searching for answers she did not want to find. She had thought that knowing the truth would bring her peace, but it had done the opposite. The truth, now unveiled, was a living thing, gnawing at the present, clawing at the walls, and there was no escaping it. The sins of the fathers would never be forgotten, and neither would the children. Madeline stood before the darkened altar, the silence now oppressive, as though the whole of the orphanage, the whole of the town, was holding its breath. The storm raged on outside, but it was no longer the wind she feared. It was the truth, and it had come for her. The room was dim, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls, their movement mirroring the trembling of Sister Annis's hands. She sat in the same chair she had occupied for years. The dark habit she wore as familiar to her skin as a prison. Her face, once sharp with purpose, had softened with age, the lines of time etching deeper with every passing day. Every day spent buried in the same silence that had haunted her for decades. The weight of those years, of all that she had hidden, pressed down on her now, suffocating in its intensity. She hadn't wanted to speak. She hadn't been able to, not until now. But the truth was a thing that could not remain buried forever. Not when it clawed at her from the depths of her soul, twisting her insides. It had started with the children, those quiet faces, their innocent eyes that had looked to her for protection, for solace, and it had ended with them all disappearing into the shadows. The storm outside raged against the windows, the wind howling like a choir of ghosts, and still she sat in the silence of her own confession. The air in the room was thick, the heavy incense that had once soothed her now clinging to her skin like soot. The chapel itself had taken on the stains of the sins it had witnessed. She had never been able to rid herself of it. The scent, the stain, the weight of what had been done. It was always there, lingering in the air, in the walls, in her own body. Sister Agnes's eyes drifted to the altar, where the dim candlelight barely illuminated the statue of Christ. His eyes, carved in cold stone, stared at her unblinking. How long had she knelt before that image, seeking solace, seeking forgiveness? She had not found it, not in the prayers, not in the rituals, not in the years spent in the quiet shadows of the orphanage. It had all been a lie. Her breath quickened as memories flooded back. The walls of the orphanage had always been thick, thistles between them impenetrable. The children had come to her for comfort, for safety, as if she could provide them with something she did not perceive. They had looked to her for something she could never give. She had tried God help her. She had tried to be what they needed, what they wanted her to be, a mother, a protector, but she had failed them all. The bell tolled in the distance, its sound, distant but clear, and the haunting echo of it stirred something deep inside her. An ache, a shiver of guilt that crawled up her spine. She had known the truth long before she had ever acknowledged it, long before it had become impossible to ignore. The children had disappeared, yes, but they hadn't just vanished. They had been taken by the hands of those who were supposed to protect them, by the hands of those who had sworn an oath to care for them. Her hands gripped the edge of their care, her knuckles white, as she forced herself to speak the words that had been locked away for so long. The air in the room felt heavy, as though thievery walls were listening, waiting for her to say it. Say it, Agnes, she thought. Say what you know. Elias, she whispered, her voice cracking in the silence. She had never spoken his name aloud, not to Anatharazal, not since that day. He was the one who started it. But him. The words, once so distant, now tumbled out in a flood, breaking through the dam she had built around them. The flood of memories surged forward, and she could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Elias had been the headmaster. He had been the one who had first made the children disappear, the first to carry out the terrible decisions that had led them all to their end. But he had not been alone. She had been with him, complicit in every moment, in every choice. She had helped him make it happen, and now there was no escaping it. I thought I was doing the thing, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was what God wanted. They were just too broken, too lost, to be saved. And Elias, he said. He said we could save them, if we just She trailed off, the rest of the sentence choking her as it always did. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she forced herself to continue. The others, they had no idea. The other sisters, the children, they were all so blind. But I knew what was a party, and I said nothing. I allowed it to happen. We made them disappear, one by one. We sealed their names away in the records, and webbed them in the walls. It was it was for their own good, Elias said. Hesed, it was what had to be done. Her breath came ragged now, words spilling out in a torrent, unstoppable. And when Eliza, when she waced first, when she was taken, we just we just watched. We never even told anyone. We never said a word. We let them go. And we buried the truth beneath the chapel floor. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest, as if the confession itself had come alive, as if the very truth of it had taken form and was now pressing against her, strangling her. The crypt beneath the chapel, It wasn't just a tomb for the dead, it was a tomb for them. The children who never had a voice, the names we erased, the faces we forgot. They are still in the walls, still in the floor, still in the ground. They never lived, they never will. The room felt colder now. The silence seemed deeper, more oppressive, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of her words. She stared at the altar, the candles flickering weakly, as though even they could feel the weight of what she had just confessed. The truth was not a release. It was a burden, a weight that pressed down on her chest, crushing her, drowning her. The relief she had hoped for, the absolution she had once thought might come with speaking the truth, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only horror. Horror at what she had done. Horror at the monstrous secret that had been buried beneath the chapel floor, beneath the children's feet, beneath the very earth itself. Her voice trembled as she whispered the final, damning truth. I was the one who helped him. I helped bury them. I was the one who sealed their fate. I am just as guilty as was. And as the last syllable left her lips, the room grew colder still, the candlelight flickering weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. In that silence, Madeline could feel it, the presence of the children, the ones whose names she had never known, Theons whose fates had been sealed by the hands of those who were supposed to protect them. They were still here, still waiting, still calling her name.